Hello and welcome back. I have written some stories for my friends for Christmas, and I'm here to read one of them to you. This one is Figma. It's the one that I wrote for my friend Miriam. The real question is not whether life exists after death. The real question is whether you are alive before death. The night was quiet as Miriam closed the door of her practice with a soft snap. Nothing but the whispering wind along the cobbles of the main street greeted her, not even the soft flicker of candlelight from the surrounding houses. Gathering her jade-green cloak around her, the rabbit-white fur trim ruffled from the soft early autumn breeze, she began making her careful way down the street. The heels of her firm leather sandals clacked on the stone. She paused for a moment to pat the pouch attached to her hip, running her finger along the edge of the pin attached there. It was made of shining silver and painted with a red cross upon a red jewel, marking her as a healer. She was glad she had worn the long skirt tonight. There was a chill in the air. Miriam wondered if the shivers she felt along her arms and spine were from the wind alone, or if her very being was sensing danger in her late-night journey. There was something eerily unsettling about the town, which was usually so full of life, laughter, and light, completely devoid of such things at such a late hour. Miriam's only company was the moon, lighting a glittering path along the cobblestone. She cast several glances around as she headed for the great stone arch marking the entrance of the town. Not a soul could be seen stirring. Windows were latched tightly, shutters of stores were drawn. The town could be deserted. It felt a bit like a nightmare, and for a moment she wondered if she had, in fact, become lucid in the middle of one of her own dreams. The rough stone beneath her feet and the bitter breeze, however, convinced her she was completely awake. Still, she couldn't help but wish for something, just a sign of life within the quiet town, to remind her she wasn't entirely alone in the world. Happily, her tired eyes caught sight of a single glow in a window as she passed the city limits. It was the light of a candle, and as soon as she located it, she realized she wasn't surprised at where it was. At the very edge of town, kissing the knee-high wooden fence that marked the border, was a small shop. It was a bit ramshackle but warm, with a navy blue roof and dark wooden logs for walls. The front door had been filled with multicolored glass, which seemed to let off a soft glow all its own. A roughly carved wooden sign, usually vibrant during daylight hours, hung over the colorful front door. Miriam couldn't read the sign in the shadow looming over the shop, but she knew what it said. Spell scripter. It was here that April spent her days in the company of the creatures she loved most in the world, books and magic. The candlelight was coming from a single open window on the side of the shop facing the road, but even as Miriam passed it, she didn't see April inside. She marveled for a moment at April's trust in the town. Couldn't someone easily pass the shop and swipe something through the window? She considered stepping forward and closing the window for her friend, but decided against it. April's confidence must have been justified. Of course she had protective spells on her shop. Miriam stepping in would only give away her presence, a scenario she would like to avoid at all costs, even if April was her friend. She had more important matters to attend to, so she turned away to continue her trek outside of the city, but even as she did, the pouch at her hip twitched a little and a tiny clay creature with a wide, hollow eyes and a single round hole for a mouth popped its head from the top. A small white daisy was attached to the side of the creature's head. The tiny golem tapped Miriam's side with its small hand and made a soft squeaking noise, gesturing toward the shop as Miriam departed from it. "Hush, Daisy," Miriam whispered to the golem, patting its head with a single finger to calm it. "I know you want to go see April and Apollo, but it's late, and they're probably asleep." Even though Miriam knew this wasn't true, April tended to burn the midnight oil in her studies of the arcane arts, she also knew that Daisy would not settle down unless it knew there was absolutely no way it would see its friends. Seeming disappointed, but accepting the answer, Daisy lowered itself back into the medicinal bag at Miriam's hip, and the young woman continued out of the city, passing under the great stone arch. She exhaled a soft breath as she felt the tingle of the border spells split along her body to allow her through them. The spells were complicated, more complicated than she even bothered to understand. The simplified version, the mayor of the town had explained upon the construction of the force field, was that upon exiting or entering the city, the spells checked if the passerby were outsiders or citizens. Citizens could pass nearly without incident, while outsiders were subject to further scrutiny. Miriam had often wondered what further scrutiny meant, but the spells had yet to cause anyone any real trouble. In fact, they were very efficient at keeping out the bulk of thieves and other would-be plunderers of the city. Miriam turned to gaze back at the city one last time before continuing. Here was Sentinel Village, her home, so named because it was a single village on the edge of the encroaching forest. A collection of colorful homes and shops huddled together in a bowl-shaped field like a flock of comfortable birds in a sea of golden grain. In the distance, she could see the outlines of the real sentinels of the kingdom, the Star-Reach Mountains. The moon was a silver gem in the sky behind the mountains. She could barely make out the apex of the highest mountain, called God's Reach, which appeared to touch the largest star in the sky, giving the mountain range its name. The moonlight sparkled off the roofs of the city. Miriam saw smoke rising from several smokestacks. Some citizens were more sensitive to early autumn chill than others. She cast her eyes around the rooftops until she found a rather odd-shaped plume of smoke rising from a squat shop in the center of the village. Rather than the puffy black wisps that rose from the other buildings, this shop had smoke rings that reflected rainbow colors, like sunlight off a puddle of oil. Miriam smiled to herself. Lexi, too, was awake, it seemed. Did none of her friends sleep? Turning from the sight, Miriam headed toward the cluster of trees several strides down the road leading from the city, the marker of the edge of the Lumen Forest. Lumen Forest was renowned as one of the most magical places in the kingdom. Marking the border between her kingdom and the neighboring one, it was relied upon to provide a great deal of defense in the event of an attack from other nations. Happily, this feature of the forest had never been necessary in all of Miriam's lifetime. By far the most remarkable part of the forest was the trees. They grew so thickly clustered together that at times they seemed to form a nearly impenetrable phalanx. They balanced this unbreakable appearance with their fragile emerald leaves, which let off a soft rainbow glow in the moonlight. The forest floor was a carpet of tickling ferns, and as Miriam trekked down the road leading to the forest, she could hear tiny skittering noises of small creatures racing through the undergrowth. Looking over her head, she saw nothing but a blanket of greenery. She felt for a moment like she was being swaddled in a great earthen quilt. She heard a flutter of wings and caught sight of a flock of revenant crows, their fierce, glowing amber eyes, 2 pairs on each bird, watching as she strode through. April liked to claim the crows were good boys, despite their fierce appearance, but Miriam had to admit she wasn't entirely convinced. She was startled as a voice suddenly broke through the serenity of the late-night forest. "Bit late for a jaunt into the forest, eh?" Miriam jumped and looked around frantically for the source of the voice, finally looking up into the trees and spotting a lone figure perched upon a thick branch above her head. It was a young woman in her mid-20s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back into a tight bun. She couldn't see them in the darkness of the forest, even despite the soft glow from the trees, but Miriam knew the girl had bright, curious sapphire eyes. The woman wore a black cloak over her white blouse and black pants with fierce white boots. She had a small smirk on her face. "Oh, April," Miriam said, pressing a hand over her heart and feeling its flutter against her fingertips. "You scared me." April let out a soft chuckle. "Trust me, I'm the least of your worries," she said good-humouredly, but then she grew more serious. "It's dangerous out here, Miriam. What are you doing?" Miriam felt a tinge of guilt at her friend's words, but she was right. Miriam shouldn't even really have been out here. Passage through the forest was forbidden to anyone without a permit, and for good reason. There were things much more dangerous than revenant crows lurking in the forest, especially at this hour. "I know," she said with a sigh, then looked back up at her friend, eyes narrowed in determination. "But I needed to gather moon dust and moon dew. It can only be gathered on full moons." April finished her sentence, nodding with understanding. Miriam nodded. "Yes. And my stock from last time I gathered it is almost depleted, and I need it for poison antidotes." She cut herself off, realizing she had involuntarily admitted to having snuck from the town, at least on one other occasion, to gather moon dust and dew, but April merely smirked a bit and stayed silent. Miriam waited for a moment for the other woman to ask why Miriam couldn't have asked April or Lexi to get the necessary items for her, as they both had a permit to enter the forest at any time. Miriam had a response ready, but to her surprise, the other woman simply made a thoughtful humming sound, then straightened and stretched, seeming to have come to an understanding. "Right, well, I won't keep you," she said, "but just so you know, I'm only up here because I heard screech howls. And there is no way I'm getting in the way of a pack of Morrigan wolves. Just be careful, okay?" Miriam nodded, and her friend turned to leap through the branches. The young woman with the light caramel-colored hair waited until the soft rustles of her friend's departure had faded, then released the breath she had been holding and relaxed her shoulders. Turning, she cast her eyes around the floor of ferns, searching for a bushy black-tufted foxtail, but seeing none, she turned and diverted from the road and into the deeper part of the lumen forest. The further Miriam walked into the forest, the thicker the brush around her legs and beneath her feet got. She felt thorns of rose bushes catch upon her cloak and emerald green skirt. Mud splashed upon the golden trim of the skirt and darkened the pure white of the fur around the cloak. She pressed a palm over the pouch at her hip and felt the warm clay form of Daisy and felt a bit of courage return to her. She pushed on as the night grew darker around her like a curtain. After what felt like hours that stretched on, Miriam finally saw what she was looking for. A patch of the forest where the trees grew a bit sparse, as thin as they ever did in this forest, and where the moonlight shone in a single glittering ray through the leaves. Feeling excitement bubble up within her, she rushed forward, barely taking heed of the forest around her, so intent was her focus. As she approached the beam of light, she looked around the edges of the ray with all the focus of a highly trained eye, until her eyes finally alit upon the fruits of her search. Around the edges of the ray of moonlight, the rainbow-colored leaves broke the light up, forming a dappled pattern across the underbrush and ground. The dappling of the light hardened when it hit the rainbow aura of the leaves, forming into a liquid, which then clustered at the edges of the leaves before dripping down like rainwater to the forest floor below. Now that she stood nearer to the ray of moonlight, she could hear it, the soft plink of moondew hitting the forest floor. She searched the ground until she found a deposit of moondew, where the droplets from several leaves coalesced as they hit the ground and formed a silvery puddle upon the blanket of leaves that covered the dark soil. Excitedly, she lifted a small vial from the pouch at her hip and had to shake Daisy from it before she lowered it to the puddle. The first drops she gathered spilled from the mouth of the bottle again because of her trembling hands, so she forced herself to steady them before dipping the vial into the puddle again. When she lifted it, it was full of glittering silver liquid, which she capped and placed into her pouch. Next, she looked around the boundary of the puddle. Where the droplets of moondew hit the ground, the small droplets would splash off and harden, becoming silver moon dust. Finding traces of the powder along the ground, Miriam carefully lifted debris from the forest floor and shook the dust into another vial. Meanwhile, Daisy was crawling along the forest floor, shoveling the viscous soil, heavy with liquefied moonlight, into its mouth and making content squeaking noises. Miriam didn't notice how quiet the forest had become until she lifted the vial of moon dust to compare its glisten to that of the original ray of moonlight, and only then it was because she realized she wasn't hearing Daisy's happy squeaks anymore. Daisy? She looked around the ground for a moment, worried she had somehow crushed the tiny clay figure, but the golem was nowhere to be seen. Daisy? Standing slowly in case she had missed the tiny doll, she stowed the moon dust into her pouch and stepped forward a bit. A high-pitched howl broke through the chilly night air, and as it rose to a high-pitched screech that almost sounded like a human scream, Miriam felt a gust of wind rise against her skin, almost as though the very wind itself was stirred by the howl. Morrigan wolves. There was a well-known and often repeated saying in Sentinel Village. Should you hear their howls, they're warning you, but hear their growls, and you are doomed. This phrase was a roughly translated warning about Morrigan wolves, some of the most fearsome creatures found in the Lumen Forest. The saying rose unbidden to Miriam's mind as the howl rang out again. Daisy! She called frantically this time, casting frightened glances over the small opening around the ray of light. Finally, she spotted the tiny golem, who with a mouthful of thick, muddy soil was unable to utter a sound. The clay figure's belly was round and full. It had clearly gorged itself and could hardly move. Daisy! As Miriam, feeling relief washing over her, stepped toward the tiny doll, there was a sound that made her freeze in terror. A rough, low growl echoed around her, seeming to come from everywhere, from the very air itself. It somehow sounded of gnashing metal teeth, crunching bones, and bloody flesh. A smell rose in the forest, dried blood, mangy fur, and dusty feathers. As Miriam watched, a massive hulking shape loomed in the darkness. What she had thought to be a bush suddenly flicked open massive, glowing red eyes. A leg, as thick around its tree branches above her head, reached out and stomped down into the clearing around the moonlight ray. A hulking beast emerged into the moonlight. Its spade-shaped head had an elongated snout. It bared its teeth and snarled, its breath stinking of blood and meat. Its eyes glowed ruby red. The wolf was covered in silky black fur, mottled with patches of silver from the moonlight. Its claws were as black as its pelt. Dusty raven wings were folded to its sides. The Morrigan wolf stepped forward and snarled at Miriam, but before she could react, there was a soft squeak, and she watched as Daisy leapt from the ground toward the creature. "No!" Miriam's reaction was immediate. Something fierce and maternal rose from within her, and she felt a familiar twinge of cold rush through her veins, starting at her feet. In an instant she could feel a rush of warmth from around her, could feel a low thrumming in the earth beneath her feet, as though the forest were reaching out toward her. As the cold reached her fingertips, she shrieked a word. Figma. The thick soil around the wave of moonlight began to stir, then to rise, bubbling up like a thick liquid into cone shape. Then another cone shape began growing beside the first. The soil grew around Daisy, building first a pair of stump-like legs, then a lower torso, then a pair of hammer-like arms, and finally a round head. The soil golem was much larger than Daisy had been originally, coming to Miriam's chest. It was dark, its flesh comprised of the fluid-filled soil that had constructed it. Flecks of grass and tiny patches of moss stuck out from it. Gentle streams of mercury-like moonlight trickled down its sides. "Go!" Miriam shouted, with a roar to rival that of the Morrigan wolves. Daisy stepped forward, reaching toward the looming shape of the wolf. The wolf stepped forward, a great black beast. Its teeth, shining in the moonlight, streaming through the forest canopy, flashed like knives cleaving flesh. Its paws were easily the size of Miriam's face. Its tail was a whip, lashing the bark of the nearby trees. Miriam knew that if it leapt and spread its raven-like wings, it could soar over an entire house as easily as taking a single step. The Morrigan wolf lowered itself and bared its teeth, preparing to pounce upon the strange, lumpy creature. Then it leapt forward with a snarl, lashing at Daisy's flesh with midnight-colored claws. The claws caught in the golem's dark flesh, flicking flecks of soft forest soil. The golem grunted, but did not halt its motion. Before the wolf could dislodge itself from the soil, which was now caving around the wolf's paw and leg, the golem fell forward, embracing the wolf's face and head. The golem was heavy with soil, water, and forest floor detritus, and as it fell forward it brought the hulking creature's head and torso down with it. With a gurgling snarl, the wolf snapped Daisy's arm, rending it from the golem's body and sending it shuddering to the soil. With a massive yelp, the wolf tore its leg from Daisy's body and slashed at the golem's leg in turn. The soft dirt erupted with the impact, and Daisy stumbled to one leg, still holding the wolf's other paw with its other arm. The golem gave a mighty grumbling roar, and drove the entirety of its remaining weight toward the writhing wolf. The wolf finally managed to free its paw from Daisy's remaining arm, and it darted back, snarling at the creature. Miriam felt exhaustion creeping through her veins, the cold twinge of the magic lessening to a trickle. Any moment she would lose control, and lose Daisy. But she gritted her teeth and narrowed her eyes at the wolf, as though daring it to attack, despite hoping it wouldn't. She wasn't certain she had the energy to withstand another onslaught from the muscled, massive creature. However, the wolf merely snarled and arched its back before turning and darting into the brush and away, leaving long smears of its crimson blood along the leaves. It was all over in a matter of seconds. The Morrigan wolf disappeared, but Miriam stood for just a moment more, paralyzed with the terror that had propelled her actions, before collapsing to the forest floor and burying her face in her hands. She felt the cold of magic seeping from her veins, leaving only the weary exhaustion that descended upon her after every use of her power. Large golems, though they lasted less time, took much more power to create than the smaller assistants she was accustomed to, so for a moment she knelt upon the forest floor, panting and regaining strength in her legs before she was able to rise. Daisy turned toward Miriam with the soft crackle of shifting earth, reaching with its remaining arm toward her. Miriam gazed up at her friend and smiled softly. "You did great, Daisy," she said, panting softly. "I'm sorry I couldn't do better." The golem made a soft noise that sounded like wind through pipes. It moved to take a step forward, but stumbled. It gazed at her through empty holes of eyes. Right before Miriam felt the magic drain from her entirely, she saw a single drop of hardened moonstone drip from the golem's eye. The magic finally evaporated from her, and Daisy's life with it. The soil making up the golem's new body hardened, leaving nothing but a statue. The next morning, Miriam sat at the fireplace in her cottage, a modest stone-walled number with a soft magenta roof. The sign hanging over the light pink door read, "Healer." Inside, the cottage was cozy, with 2 single beds with crisp, clean, bleach-white sheets and a privacy curtain hung between them. The fireplace was large enough for a sizable fire, and a warm magenta rug was spread across the floor before the hearth. Along the wall to the right of the door, as one entered, was a long counter of warm, honey-colored wood, upon which sat various medical instruments, glistening silver in the flickering light from the flames. as well as clear bottles filled with various powders, liquids, and tablets. It was beside the fireplace that Miriam now sat, upon a squat stool matching the honey wood of the counter, stoking the flames with a fan as she eyed the cauldrons set within them. Inside the cauldron, a pat of thick clay was heating, melting steadily in the increasing heat. Just as the clay was melting into a viscous liquid, Miriam dropped a certain single piece of moonstone. She then poured a small amount of moondew into the cauldron, which swirled with the melted clay, making a ribbon of silver appear throughout it. With her other hand, she pressed her fingers to the words inscribed upon her pin, which she held upon her left knee. "Figma," she whispered. Slowly the clay began to rise, forming around the single piece she had dropped into the cauldron. She watched as it took shape into a lumpy little figure with stumpy legs and small arms, round eyes, and a hole for a mouth. The moondew in its skin reflected the firelight. Lessening the heat, she reached in and lifted the golem from the cauldron, not minding the heat that scorched her fingers. As the golem began to dry, its expressionless eyes blinked at her. A single drop of moonstone was embedded under its red eye. After a moment, as its skin hardened and dried, it made a happy squeaking sound and clapped its hands together with a small ringing sound. Smiling a bit, Miriam spoke. "Hello, Moon. Thank you for listening."